Welcome back to Ceasefire Podcast. This is episode 9. We actually just published episode 5. So for those of you who have been supporting this and listening, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
In the extended sequences and segments that we have, we will thank the people who have been supporting the podcast at the time of episode 5 going out. If you believe in what we're doing here and you like these videos, if you're listening as a podcast or you're watching on YouTube, you're missing out on so many extra segments. A lot of the short videos we've been publishing are coming from those extra segments. So $10 a month on Patreon will get you into 8 extra segments a month. That's 2 a week. You get the trenches and the debrief. So head over to ceasefirepodcast.com and join today. That's how we're going to do this thing long term, is if we get that support base. Hopefully we'll be monetized on YouTube soon enough, and we can offer the same exact thing. If you just prefer to stay on YouTube, you can become a member. So today's episode, this one's tough. It's big. Whose morality is right? And we want to break down what is morality, where does it come from, and how do you determine whose morality is right? Andrew, we were looking at some situations with Twitter and Elon and the public discourse and just the continued polarization. And we landed on this subject because we think it's sort of an undercurrent to everything that's going on. But maybe I'll define what is morality, and I'm going to kick it to you. So morality is a set of principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. That's basically what it is. It's right and wrong, a set of rules and principles for right and wrong. What can you do? What can't you do? There's also moral obligation, I think, sort of built into the understanding of morality. Moral obligation is the idea that you ought to do these things and ought not to do these things. You're obligated from some exterior force. So where does it come from, though? Like, why is there this big debate about who's right and who's wrong, and why are people leaving Twitter?
Well, the earmark of now in our society, beyond the divide, which is what we're directly and indirectly addressing in every aspect of every segment of every episode here, the earmark of our society, beyond being divided, is that divide exists because there are 2 sides, 2 viewpoints, 2 moralities, and each of those sides believes in a version of right and wrong that's very different from one another. And they believe that they're opposing the bad, the evil that is represented by the opposite side from their own viewpoint.
Right.
So morality, and this is maybe a separate discussion, but morality has come to the forefront as the motivation for the divide and for the passionate disagreements that we have in our world now regarding politics and culture and the like. And this has been very much inflamed by the media discourse and fear promotion and the like. If basically the messaging, anytime you turn on any major media platform, the messaging is, we need to be afraid because these bad guys are doing this. And if we don't step up and resist these bad guys that are doing this, the whole world's going to fall apart.
Right.
And that is why we are where we are as a society right now. So when talking morality, we're talking, as you said, right and wrong. And there are 2 basically opposed versions of morality right now that are being presented in the media, in politics, and just neighbor to neighbor. And so we need to look at, how do we evaluate what's right and what's wrong, and what's the basis for our evaluation? And then we probably need to look at, is there evidence in society? Is there evidence in history when you take certain stances on certain issues or policies, or even philosophically, are there societies that have displayed evidence as to whether a particular morality works or doesn't work? So I'll kick it back to you.
Well, and when you talk about how it's meting out in culture, it makes me think. I'm reading through Tim Keller's book, Finding God in the Modern World, and then it's actually called Making Sense of God. It's a great book. Here, I'll hold it up for people actually watching the video. This thing is deep, and if you enjoyed his book, Reason for God, this one's a bit more of a deep dive. And he got on the subject of morality, and it sort of sparked in me an idea. And so I wrote this down because it's so relevant to what we're talking about with respect to how we're seeing it in culture with polarization, right? The polarization in culture is partly stemming from the jettison of moral absolutes, rules, and truth, while simultaneously pushing for a set of absolutes and rules to be followed after saying there are no absolutes. So you basically say there are no absolutes, but mine are right and must be followed. So I don't think you can escape this. In the debate about what we're going to do with law or what we're going to do with Twitter or how things are going to happen with respect to allowing people to do this or that, you fundamentally have to accept that there is something in us that determines, hey, there's right and wrong. Right and wrong exists as concepts sort of outside of us. It's almost like it's pushing in on us. So when I look at the polarization in culture, both sides are doing exactly the same thing. They're just doing it from opposite sides. And I do think there is one side in the debate that has sort of said, no, we're going to jettison out from moral absolutes and truth, while at the same time arguing as if moral absolutes and truth exist. Because if it doesn't, then why is their side right and the other side wrong? I think that's the great challenge in the debate, is we haven't even gotten to determining whose morality is right. That's the subject of today's episode. But if you don't really know where morality comes from and you try to chisel at the very foundation of its existence, it's really difficult to then argue for right and wrong in all these circumstances as hotly as everybody does.
Yeah, it's very difficult unless we have an agreed upon set of rules for defining what morality is and what are our agreed upon societal norms. This gets back to the fact that we have two different nations right now that are living based upon two different sets of norms.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it's a problem is because it's being pushed by both sides that the other side needs to do what the opposite side wants in terms of morality. But I think where the problem comes in and the disconnect comes in is when you're trying to force a set of beliefs on a group that doesn't inherently ascribe to those beliefs. That principle alone causes problems. When you're forcing your set of morality on people that don't agree with it. I think we were able for a period of time, when we look at American history, I feel like there is the entire history up to basically the Kennedy assassination. And then everything after that is sort of the modern era.
Mm-hmm.
And the modern era has been inching closer and closer to this polarized state that we're in now, because there was a disconnect in the 60s. Basically, a group of people emerging who were challenging the status quo, which is the, traditional sort of conservative set of values that were so prominent for so long in our country. And that element has been growing and growing and growing to where now that is the mainstream narrative and mainstream belief structure.
Yeah.
And so we've got the traditional, the conservative, whatever word you want to use, the red that's represented by, XYZ and bullet points regarding, what that morality is defined by, and then you've got a more progressive take on the way life should be lived and the way society should be run. And perhaps we should kind of bullet point out, what defines each of those. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
if I say that I'm a progressive person, what does that mean?
Mhm.
From a moral perspective, what are the bullet points of those things? Could you think of a few, specifics
The thing is
to the
there's
mantra?
it gets really difficult, but I'm going to try to make this easy to break down into those categories. First and foremost, at the very base, there's two philosophies about where morality comes from. There's the philosophy that says it comes from some external absolute source, some higher power. That would be a more religious or philosophical approach to morality. And then there's the idea that it sort of comes from evolutionary progression of survival, tribalistic, what's good for the group, okay? So once you sort of try to build from those two philosophies, even then I think it breaks down. Let's just say it did come from right and wrong came through cooperative measure of grouping and tribing up because it made it easier and better to survive and flourish as a human being. Let's just say that's true, right? Even if that's your foundation, right now the more progressive, more liberal line of thinking is rooted in self-fulfillment. So then it's not about the group. It's not about what's good for the group. It's about what's good for me, which is going to frame and shape your morality a lot differently than if you said, well, no, we're supposed to do good of the group here. You see these tensions put on display in shows like where there's an apocalypse. What do you do? Do you try to cling to morality, right and wrong, and preferring the other and helping other people? Or is it all about you and survival? And do you kill anybody that gets in your way? That's a common tension in those movies and shows. Like in The Walking Dead, that was, real early on, you could see there were people trying to cling to right and wrong, and there were people that are like, that world doesn't exist anymore. It's us or them. And I do think some of the sharpness in the dividing culture is stemming from that self-fulfillment idea, which is going to affect the way you approach morality and right and wrong. You're going to frame your judgment of people, persons, or situations around what's good for me, not what's good for culture or the group. You don't care if it fragments culture. You don't care if it leads to the degradation of life. Is it good for you? Which is interesting because a lot of the dialogue centers around, eat the rich and take from the rich. And it's like, well, if it's all about self-fulfillment, man, they're living a great life. Why should we take away from them? And if self-fulfillment's your driving cause for morality, isn't being very greedy and cutthroat a good thing? Like, isn't that then a good thing? And that's where if you don't have some external set of rules for morality, if it's only stemming from survival of you or survival of the group, you can end up, I think, in areas where you're arguing for things that we innately know are wrong. We do. We know that murder is wrong, and we know that greed at the cost of the other is wrong. We just sort of know that innately, but if morality just purely grows out of survival of the group or survival of the fittest, then why is it wrong for one tribe to kill another if it helps their tribe flourish? What rule set are you bringing to that discussion that's bigger than survival of the group, that's bigger than survival of you or your self-fulfillment? Because fundamentally, self-fulfillment means you first, everybody else second. I think that's where, if you look at the breakdown of like traditional conservative morality and the new sort of wave of morality, more conservative morality is about a higher power. It's about doing what's right for culture. Now, that doesn't mean that conservatives and Republicans have done a very good job of like taking care of the poor and being sympathetic and empathetic to those who are on the fringes of society. I'm not actually saying that there isn't baked in hypocrisy about this, but I think both sides are guilty of being hypocritical by saying either there is no morality, but mine's right and yours is wrong, or morality is all about this external force of right and wrong, and we should be preferring others and loving others. Well, has that traditionally happened? I think both sides have failed to live up to their own standards, which ultimately calls into question How do we judge those failings? Is there a meta morality that could be applied to both sides?
A lot in there to discuss, and a couple thoughts that I had while you were talking there. One is this. Now, you mentioned the idea of taking care of the poor,
Mm-hmm.
and how that's been kind of an area of failure or weakness on the traditional side or the conservative side. And I think that's become increasingly obvious. And when you over the decades in recent history, and when you sort of branch out with that topic, you get into the notions of capitalism and the disparity between the wealthy and the middle class, or the wealthy and the poor. And I think one of the things that makes the progressive approach very appealing, especially to emerging generations, tying it back into morality, is this idea of equality, this idea of inclusion. The traditional approach, or the traditionalist angle, has always been advantageous for those that are upper middle class and above, that are of the majority racially, and all of those, as you mentioned, that are on the fringes, or that are in minority type groups. I'm not speaking just racially, I'm talking on a societal plane here. Those have been minimized. Those people maybe, or people that are represented in those groups, have many times felt that they've been minimized by the almost bullying nature of the traditionalists and those that are in power, right? So you've got this movement of equality, and these are kind of like the core tenets of progressivism, right? In terms of morals: equality, equity, social justice. I would argue that social justice is a huge tenet for anyone that would claim to be progressive, and justice would be the core tenet of a more traditional conservative approach. And what are the differences between the two? When you add the word social, you're basically saying that you're giving to those almost in an unequal basis, not based upon merit or what they deserve. You're giving, it's basically the idea of taking from those that have and giving it to those who do not have, whether they've earned it or not. And justice basically says, you're getting what you've earned, or what you've worked and deserved, right? So you expand that a little bit further into economic philosophy, and morality is a guiding principle for a more socialistic approach to government, bigger government, basically, empowering the government with taxpayer dollars to provide for those that have less, and those that do have contribute a greater share to the government, and then the government decides on where to distribute those funds. And the further we go, the more we're leaning in that direction. The more conservative approach from a moral perspective says, again, it's a little bit more capitalistic. You get what you work for. And so therefore, smaller government, less government intervention, less government dollars for things like medicine or school and the like. So, these are, again, I'm trying to just define like the divide here, define the two sets of morality and what the implications are of those things when we're speaking in terms of policy, government, and the execution of life in our society.
Yeah, and I do think deciding between the two, you have to have something that's bigger than each of those systems.
You have to have a basis for a decision.
Right. It's almost as if, and this is another thing that I wrote, sort of reading through this book and thinking through morality as a concept. Morality as an idea is super or meta-natural. It's above everything. Just the idea of morality Declaring that certain actions are right and others are wrong is not natural. It exists above nature and can only really exist amongst humans. Tell living bacteria to not infect and kill. Tell the predator to not kill and eat without pain and suffering. Morality as a concept is deeply religious, regardless of how you ground it, but it is far more reasonable to ground it in something outside of nature, as that seems to be its existence and its origin. So if you've got two sides debating about whose morality is right, you almost need this meta morality or something that's above it all, saying a guiding principle of which version here is right. So I think that's difficult, because that gets back to something you said earlier. You almost have to have an agreed upon set of rules. And we don't have that right now. We have both sides arguing for their rule set. It would be playing a sports game, and you'd have one team coming with a rule set and another team coming with a rule set.
Yeah, one team's playing soccer and the other team's playing American football.
Right. If the Netherlands show up and they're going to play against the Patriots, it would be chaos, because one side is saying, well, this is the rule set, and the other side is saying, no, this is the rule set. The only way you would have a flourishing game where there's penalties and scores, punishment and reward, the only way you get there is with agreed upon rule sets. And since we don't have that right now, it's so fragmented. The minute you're trying to have a conversation with someone, you can't even start the conversation, because you need to go all the way back to fundamentals and say, wait a minute, do you even believe that truth exists? Do you even believe that right and wrong exists? Because if you don't, then what are we even talking about? It's almost as if we're talking about personal rule sets that you would like to see either honored or put out there into the fabric of society so that you can flourish as a person. And it doesn't work. You're always going to grade against somebody else's sentimentality. A really great way to look at this would be to look at the debate about marriage that has been going on for a very long time. The traditional idea of marriage being between a man and a woman, and we weren't letting homosexual persons marry. And then they were arguing that, you can't define marriage according to a religion. And I always landed on this as saying, listen, if the government wants to allow people to do this, it's not really up to us. Like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God's what is God's. Like, if the government wants to do this, that's fine. But you're always going to have a barrier that's going to stop somebody from doing something that they want. What about people who want to be polyamorous? Or what about people that want to be polygamous? Like, they want to have multiple spouses. You have to have rules and restrictions and ideas about, are we going to let people do that? What does that do with respect to the tax code? What about insurance? What about all these different things, rights and wages and everything that would be attached to that? So even the people that won in their mind, hey, we've won that fight, that cultural battleground, we won. Yeah, we can get married now, and you have to make us a cake for our wedding. Okay, what about all of the other then groups of people and persons who might be saying, well, we would like to marry in this way or that way? If you just go down the road of anarchy, no morality, everybody can do whatever they want. This touches on the legalization of drugs. This touches on decriminalization of drugs. Those are two different categories, right? Like, decriminalizing to say we're going to help people who are addicts, we want to rehabilitate them into society. But legalization would say let people do whatever they want. Let a person just slowly die and deteriorate from heroin because that's what they want to do. And if you don't have a foundational rule set about human value, human dignity, well, then there are no rules there. Let people do whatever they want. So I think even people that are more progressive and more liberal on these fronts, they still have rule sets. They still have boundaries and barriers that would disallow people doing what they want, because that's the friction. That's where the rub always is somebody somewhere is going to want to do something that you don't think they should be allowed to do. Where does that come from, and what gives you the right to tell them they can't do it?
And as of this recording, and again, we're on a 4-week or so delay in terms of when we record and when we post these episodes. So this might be a little bit moot or a little bit dated once we get around to posting this. But it's been pretty hot recently, and I don't see this going away quickly. The Twitter war that's happening right now. Ever since Elon took over Twitter, and he's been doing some pretty radical things to move the company and the platform in a different direction. You've got this huge reaction that's happening with Hollywood and celebrities and political figures. And if you're not up to speed on this, he fired a ton of employees. He reinstated a lot of accounts that were banned, like Donald Trump and a lot of conservative media outlets. And basically his argument is, look, everyone should have an equal say on this platform, whether you are left-leaning or right-leaning. And you've got all these people leaving Twitter, and you know, I heard, I have to bring this one up because it was really funny. Alyssa Milano, which I have a funny, weird connection with her. When I was in, I have to tell this story. This is really funny. When I was, I think it was when Project 86's second album came out, Drawing Black Lines, and there was a lot of good things happening around the band. And I remember my brother, who was going to UC Berkeley at the time, his fraternity brother was her brother, and they two were trying to set me up on a date with Alyssa Milano at the time, which was huge because I had a huge crush on her when I was a kid. When she was on Who Was the Boss?
Who was the boss?
I don't think the relationship would work out though nowadays.
No, I don't know. I don't think so. No,
just my gut.
Yeah.
But so she comes out and she says, and this is just one of dozens of celebrity reactions to the Twitter situation. She comes out and says, I'm paraphrasing here, but I got rid of my Tesla and I got a VW because I can't support, you know, Elon Musk, you know, racism, bigotry, and all this stuff. And then everybody just destroyed her because they just basically said, you know who started Volkswagen, right?
Right.
It was the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't really read her history on that one before she started, you know, going off. But
even that action is presuming something about right and wrong and morality. It's almost as if I want the world to see me doing the right thing, as if there's a judgment, right? Like morality assumes judgment, an external judgment.
Right.
And
because I am coming from a higher moral ground, I am leaving Twitter. I am showing the world that I am better than, or more righteous than, or whatever word you want to use, than Elon Musk and this philosophy. You know, these people, you know, basically, you know, it's anyone who isn't on board with the progressive narrative. These people don't deserve a right to talk and share their opinions because it's all hateful, racist, bigoted, you know, going on and on and down the line. You know, but 100% comes from this, we are more enlightened and higher and more kind and more generous and the like. You know, I don't want to, you know, we can deconstruct both sides of the argument and point out the flaws and the hypocrisies, because hypocrisy is inherent to the human experience. So we can't sit here and argue that one side is so much better than the other, but we can deconstruct, you know, the actual tenets of these two positions and look at when you approach things this way. And then let's just talk about it in terms of, and maybe this is Trench's discussion and I'm just teeing it up to transition here, but you know, when you talk about equality among people in society, we can break down the implications of where that leads in terms of the version of equality that's being propagated right now. And I think we could make some pretty easy conclusions about where some of this goes. And that's probably what we need to talk about. The other thing I want to mention is America did have an agreed upon set of rules for a very long period of time. And I did say this a little bit earlier, but I want to get deeper into it in the trenches. And it worked. You know, our country, our society flourished. And so there has to be some merit to looking at history and the history of America given to, you know what I'm saying? There has to be some value attributed to the agreed upon set of rules that were established for a couple hundred years plus.
But devil's advocate, I think people would push back on what you're saying and say it worked for some people. It worked for certain classes of people and persons. It didn't work for everybody. And that, I think, drove the wedge. And instead of critiquing it from its own rule set, which I think would have been more productive, like we've talked about criticizing tribe, if you're going to turn and criticize conservative, Republican, or Christian ideals and morality, critique it within its own system, and I think that would have been more fruitful. But what I think happened is that wedge got driven, and it started to be about self-fulfillment. We didn't flourish under this. We didn't do well. I didn't do well, right? I want the rule sets to be changed so that I can flourish now. And the dilemma there is it's all about a power grab. You're turning morality into, I believe it was Nietzsche who said this, that morality is just a power play. You're just attempting to exert power over others. And that, I think, is where the failing is happening, is instead of taking foundational, almost innate senses that we have, we sense that there's right and wrong. And the point I was making with Alyssa Milano was baked into morality is the idea that there will be a judgment. Like, that seems baked in. Why? Why is that baked in if it's pure?
There's a consequence to our actions.
Right. So if we're going to jettison from those foundational rule sets purely because we felt like, well, it didn't suit this group, that group, or my group, we're going to come up with a new rule set. That's where we're fragmenting and not having even a common ground to start the discussion from. So determining whose morality is right, it's like we can't even get there because we don't have foundational rule sets that are agreed upon. And I want to make sure and say this too and clarify anybody listening to this. I do think there are people who break the rules and cross lines on sites like Twitter and should be removed. I think that already Elon has kicked Kanye back off the platform because Ye went and said a bunch of horrible things.
Yeah.
And got what he deserved. Like, if you're going to break the rules, if we're going to talk about consequences, if we're going to talk about morality, if I go on to Facebook, Twitter, or if I go on to YouTube and I break the rules, I can't call foul and say censorship or this is biased or whatever. Now, where I think people have gone too far is we just use labels. Well, if you don't agree with me, you're such and such phobic. You know, let's just get, J.K. Rowling off the platform. Let's get anybody off the platform who doesn't agree with the progressive ideas about gender identity or any of those things that we've discussed in other episodes. Well, that's not the same. That's not the same as somebody going on Twitter and breaking the rules. That's somebody going on Twitter and not agreeing with you. There's a giant chasm of difference between the two, and that, I think, is a reverberation from this idea that our moral rules are right, your moral rules are wrong. So what we're going to do is we just want to remove you from the platform. We want to remove you from the public square. And one of the greatest lines from Andor, if you are a Star Wars fan, you must watch Andor, okay? Obi-Wan was terrible. Andor is easily some of the best Star Wars ever created. Second, that's a side subject, but there was this
slightly.
There was this amazing line in the finale. This guy said,
"Oh, don't say it. I haven't watched it yet."
Well, I have to say it for the point. It won't ruin it. It won't ruin it.
Okay.
There's a guy in the show who wrote a manifesto, and you finally get to hear a part of it, okay? And he says that tyranny is brittle because they're always having to fight for control. And I think we see that in the way that people are approaching this sort of social war on Twitter and out in the culture. It's so brittle and insecure, and it's like, as you said in one of our episodes, it's that cornered animal mentality because we have to always fight for the power. We always have to fight to be the mob, to be the larger group. And it's exhausting. Why not put it down and say, let's seek common ground. Let's find a way out of this. This will never work. It won't work. Culture can't thrive, survive, and flourish under the weight of two sides attempting essentially tyrannical rule of the other. It just won't work. When he said that, I thought that is such a great summary of why everyone's so afraid and so shaky and fragile, because tyranny is brittle. And that's the approach everyone's taking to morality, right and wrong, and these cultural discussions. It's almost an assumed tyrannical mob rule as opposed to agreed upon rule sets, and then we progress from there.
So when we decide upon a morality and we're reaching the jumping off point here into the trenches,
Yeah.
we have to decide on what is our basis for evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and you'll probably debate me on this, I think the first basis for evaluating morality is, again, we're not just talking about individuals, we're talking about society here. What works?
Right.
You know, what does this work to have a flourishing body of people in a nation? Or is this a piece of belief that actually hurts us in the long run? Because ultimately what we would want here is to set up a unified group of people who agree on the core tenets and then agree to disagree on non-essentials. It's kind of like church, right?
Right.
With a denomination. You know, denomination is defined by core theological foundational principles, and then also an agreement upon what is non-essential. So you can have the freedom to disagree within those non-essential issues, so long as we come together and agree on these core issues. Now, you look at church history, we've got a lot of denominations and breakoffs and disagreements and splits, and you know.
Yep.
So humans are always going to disagree. Humans are always going to have hierarchy. Humans are always going to try to assert on an individual and a tribal level a dominance or a moral superiority to other groups. You know, and so as we get into the trenches here and sort of actually evaluate these two positions, you know, I think the starting basis is, you know, does it work? You know, does it propagate a circumstance or a situation where the nation or the group of people can flourish? Or by nature, is it something that's going to destroy the fabric of that society? Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term. I'm sure you've got additional evaluating points to add to that. Am I right?
Oh yeah, the pragmatic approach to morality, I think, is going to be a great discussion and debate, because I think I want to bring up, and this is a great reason to become a supporter of the show on ceasefirepodcast.com. Go to the Patreon, and eventually, you know, maybe we'll be able to say that about YouTube. Just become a member and you can hear the rest. But I want to whet people's appetites here. If we're going to go pragmatic and we're going to debate what works, I want to use thought experiments from things like Thanos in the Avengers, right, in the movie. Like, a lot of people looked at that and in a funny way debated it on Reddit. Thanos did nothing wrong as like a meme, right? And I think that is an interesting thought experiment to think through. Is a pragmatic approach to morality the way we do this? Do we get rid of the religious ideas? Do we get rid of the philosophical and just purely approach this from a pragmatic, almost objective, mathematical weighting system? Because we got to go with what works, right? The good of the group, the good of the whole, which you're going to grade against all those self-fulfillment people that are going to say, well, no, it's not about what's good for the group, it's about what's good for me. So we can head to the trenches maybe and start to be more assertive about where we think morality should come from and ultimately how you determine who's right and wrong, because we just sort of established the tension. We haven't really offered any solutions, which we think that's the goal of the flyover. Let's fly over this discussion and this topic, and then let's get into the trenches and really try to establish what we think and maybe even debate a little bit about how to approach this. So if you enjoy what we do and you want to support it, head over to the Patreon. The links are below, ceasefirepodcast.com. $10 a month gets you a bunch of extra stuff, and we're going to head over there right now. We'll see you on the other side.